When we think about the 1920s, our minds usually jump straight to, a giant, carefree jazz party. We picture flappers dancing, bootleg liquor flowing, and a stock market that just won't quit. But honestly, the reality of this decade is way more fascinating than those stereotypes. It wasn't just this endless celebration. It was actually a really intense, tension-filled tug-of-war between a rapidly modernizing future and a fiercely reactionary past. The whole era is literally defined by extreme contradictions.
So that brings us to the big question we're going to unpack in this explainer. Was the most prosperous decade in American history actually built on a fragile illusion? As we walk through the evidence today, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to look at the undeniable economic booms, for sure, but we'll also uncover the deep societal fractures that were hiding just beneath the surface. All right, let's dive right into this. To make sense of the decade, we've broken our roadmap down into 5 parts. 1. Fear, isolation, and intolerance. 2. Prohibition and organized crime. 3. Technology and mass consumption. 4. Cultural liberation and jazz. And 5. The stock market crash.
Let's kick things off with part 1, fear, isolation, and intolerance.
Right after the trauma of World War I, America took a hard reactionary turn toward isolationism. The country basically pulled away from foreign affairs and became deeply suspicious of anything that seemed un-American. Domestically, these intense fears of communism sparked some extreme government responses. Take the Palmer Raids, for example, led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. They resulted in thousands of arrests and the deportation of alleged radicals on a ship that the press actually nicknamed the Soviet Ark. And right alongside that, we see this massive surge in nativism. This pushed the passage of the 1921 Emergency Quota Act, which heavily restricted immigration. Sadly, this whole environment of fear also fueled a huge resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. They expanded rapidly across the Midwest and the Bible Belt, and ended up claiming millions of members by pushing an extremist, anti-immigrant traditionalist agenda.
So as you can imagine, this set up a massive cultural collision course. On one side, you've got modern diversity. America had really become this rich patchwork of urban ethnic communities, packed with Catholic and Jewish immigrants, bringing over completely new ideas. But on the exact opposite side, standing in direct conflict, was traditionalist nativism. These groups were pushing super hard for ultra-conservative Anglo-Saxon Protestant values, basically demanding what they called 100% Americanism.
Moving on to part 2, prohibition and organized crime.
This era brought us the ultimate progressive experiment, enacted through the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. The big goal here was a totally dry, alcohol-free society, which theoretically would eliminate poverty and crime. But, well, it definitely wasn't universally loved. Just look at the geographical and cultural divide we had. The dry South and West supported it. The South really wanted to control the social order, and the West wanted to wipe out the public drunkenness and corruption of saloons. But the wet urban eastern cities, they fiercely opposed it. For a lot of the immigrants living there, having a drink was a vital old-world cultural custom, not some sort of crime. And the hypocrisy here was just staggering. Plenty of lawmakers who publicly voted dry were privately sipping on bootleg liquor themselves.
And because of that massive public demand for alcohol, we get this absolutely jaw-dropping statistic. $18 billion. That was the upper estimate of organized crime's annual income in the U.S. by 1930. Just to put that into perspective, that number actually surpassed the revenue of the entire federal government. It's wild. Gangsters like Al Capone basically turned Chicago into a war zone, raking in millions from bootlegging. The era's lawlessness was so extreme that Capone famously used to ride through the streets of Chicago in an armor-plated bulletproof car.
This whole underground economy was completely driven by bootlegging, which totally undermined the Volstead Act. The traditional corner saloon vanished, replaced by secret, illegal clubs we know as speakeasies. People were even at home brewing bathtub gin, which, by the way, was incredibly dangerous and sometimes even lethal. But despite the risks, for the youth of the Jazz Age, defying prohibition and drinking that illegal liquor became this highly fashionable, incredibly rebellious act.
All right, let's shift gears to part 3, technology and mass consumption.
While society was busy fighting over alcohol and immigration, the American economy was going through an absolute explosion of technology. Just consider this massive number, 30 million. That's how many cars were owned by Americans by 1930. Honestly, it's hard to overstate how big this industrial revolution was. Just a couple of decades prior, early drivers broken down on muddy roads were getting mocked by people in horse-drawn carriages yelling, "Get a horse!" But once Henry Ford perfected the assembly line and literally put America on rubber tires with the affordable Model T, the automobile fundamentally changed the country's landscape, its economy, and everyday daily life.
But hey, it wasn't just cars. This era actually birthed modern consumerism. With assembly lines churning out massive quantities of goods, businesses desperately needed a way to get people to buy all this stuff. Enter sophisticated advertising and really accessible credit. The new economic mantra became possess today and pay tomorrow. So Americans totally shifted away from traditional frugal saving. Instead, they eagerly jumped into risky debt, using installment plans to buy up radios, vacuum cleaners, and all sorts of fancy new household appliances.
And the tech boom definitely didn't stay on the ground. Let's trace the really thrilling evolution of flight here. Back in 1903, the Wright brothers managed a mere 12-second flight. By World War I, planes were suddenly being used in combat as highly dangerous flying coffins. Then, jumping to 1920, we get the first transcontinental airmail route. And finally, the crowning achievement in 1927, Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic. When Lindbergh got back, New York threw him this massive ticker tape parade. To a post-war world that was feeling deeply cynical, Lindbergh's incredible triumph offered a desperately needed symbol of hope and just boundless optimism.
Okay, let's jump to part 4, cultural liberation and jazz. So, new technologies, especially the radio, started unifying the nation's culture. They were broadcasting the exact same music everywhere and standardizing accents across the country. But this cultural shift was also deeply tied to where people actually lived. The 1920 census highlighted a huge, monumental milestone: 51% urban, 49% rural. Literally, for the very first time in American history, more people were living in the cities than out in the countryside. The heartbeat of the nation had officially moved from the farm straight to the city streets.
And in those cities, a real cultural rebellion was brewing against traditional values. I absolutely love this sharp, satirical quote from critic H.L. Mencken. He defined Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, might be happy. That perfectly captures the attitude of the lost generation of writers, people like Fred Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. They were just thoroughly disillusioned by the war and completely rejected the strict societal norms and the middle-class materialism of the older generations.
Now, this rebellion was most visibly championed by the flapper. These young women completely defied traditional norms. They were wearing short dresses, bobbing their hair, and just fully embracing a bold, newfound independence. This whole youth culture was also heavily influenced by the vibrant Harlem Renaissance and the absolutely explosive popularity of jazz music. African-American pioneers created this uniquely American sound, and it really quickly became the rhythmic soundtrack for the entire decade's cultural liberation.
But remember that tug of war we talked about at the very beginning? Yeah, not everyone was on board with these cultural shifts. This led to the ultimate clash: modernist science versus religious fundamentalism. This tension totally exploded onto the national stage during the 1925 Scopes monkey trial down in Tennessee. A high school teacher was indicted for teaching Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which violated state law at the time. It became this highly publicized, incredibly bitter showdown between advocates of progressive science and defenders of a literal interpretation of the Bible. It just goes to show that the culture wars of the 1920s were fiercely intense.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, the stock market crash. After a solid decade of dizzying economic highs, mass consumption, and pretty reckless speculation, the music abruptly stopped and that economic bubble violently burst. To really understand why it crashed so hard, we have to look at how everyday people were investing. The key term you need to know here is buying on margin. Basically, this meant purchasing stocks with a tiny down payment and just borrowing the rest from a broker. Everyone from your local barber to the elevator operator was speculating. Wall Street had effectively turned into this giant gambling den. It was entirely built on the super dangerous assumption that stock prices would just keep going up forever, which would supposedly allow everyone to pay back their massive debts with quick profits.
The real tragedy here is that the warning signs were flashing red the entire time. But a society totally blinded by the illusion of endless prosperity just ignored them. Even during the good years, there were hundreds of annual bank failures. The wild Florida real estate boom had already burst after a devastating hurricane. The nation was sitting on a soaring national debt of nearly $24 billion left over from the war. And at the exact same time, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon's massive tax cuts for the wealthy left a huge surplus of capital. But instead of being used to build factories or create infrastructure, that money was pumped directly into fueling this incredibly risky Wall Street speculation.
So that brings us full circle to the contradictory legacy of the Roaring Twenties. And it leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question to think about. Does our modern reliance on easy credit and mass consumption actually mirror the hidden vulnerabilities that triggered the 1929 crash? The 1920s gave us the literal blueprint for the modern consumer lifestyle, but it also showed us the devastating consequences of ignoring systemic risks. I really hope this explainer has helped you see the Roaring Twenties not just as some dusty history lesson, but as a fascinating mirror to our own times. Think about that question and keep exploring the incredible nuances of this dynamic decade.